Good morning. What a beautiful day it is to be in the house of the Lord.
Amen. Thank you, Jesus.
Even greater that we can still come together and worship in a spirit of freedom. We don't have to hide underground, but we can enjoy worshiping with one another and learning about God's work in the open. Can anyone tell me what we've been studying about? Babylon. We're looking at Babylon. Past, present, future. Focusing more on past and future, of course. Does everybody have notes on Babel, pages 8 through 12 or something like that? I think everybody should have notes. I handed them out the other week, and of course we didn't get through them all. But we've been talking about Babylon. And if we go back to the very, very beginning, right now we're looking at Babel. So what can you tell me about the time frame that we're looking at here in Babel? It's past what major event?
Flood.
The flood. So we're looking at a people who have a drastic geographical difference, or a different earth in a sense that has now been reshaped or remolded since before the flood. Before the flood we talked about there being one continent, but now we're seeing different continents. We are seeing mountains, we are seeing valleys, we are seeing formations such as the Grand Canyon, all caused by the flood. We are also looking at the beginning of what dispensation? We went from the dispensation of conscience to the dispensation of, remember, God gave Moses 7 different things that instituted was the layout for human government. God now told him to be fruitful, multiply, rule over animals. They can now eat animals. Don't eat the blood though. Don't commit murder. Those that do will be executed. And to keep God's covenant eternally. If I say the word Shinar, what should come to mind? I know now, I'm fooling. We're talking about a geographical area, like this is Lycans Valley. And we talk about Babel, what are we referring to? A city. So we're going from the whole region down to one specific location. From Lycans Valley down to Lycans the town. Now what about Babylon? You're not going to have these in your notes, brother. These are a few lessons back. What's that? No, we're looking at a city and or an empire, depending on the context. So Shinar, geographical area. Babylon, a city or an empire. Babel is just going to be the city. And we talked about some of the key things to keep in mind is this, that everything that God does, the devil always has a copy of. He can never create anything of his own. He can only mimic. So when we look at our big long study, we see 2 main mimics. God has his holy city, which is earthly, Jerusalem. And the devil has his main city, which is our holy city, Babylon. God has his champion, who is Jesus Christ. And to counter that, the devil has his champion, who is the Antichrist. So those are the 2 key things to keep in mind as we're going through as well. We talked about Nimrod, how he was a mighty hunter. Can you tell me what his wife did, Semiramis? She made them both gods. She created her own religion. She made him the sun god, her the moon god. She also gave to herself memory such that she could be associated with other goddesses such as Aphrodite, Venus, the love goddess. Or she gave herself another title, which is Queen of Heaven. And when we compare that, along with the drawing of the image that I handed out in the appendix the other week, what religion does that gear us towards in modern day society? What do we automatically think of? Catholics. We also talked about the first religion possibly being that of astrology. We seen last time we studied 2 weeks ago how the ziggurat, which is the more than likely what the Tower of Babel looked like. The first 7 stages were each dedicated to the 7 planets. You got to the top of the temple, and there were more than likely drawings of the zodiacs or the constellations on them where they worshipped. Can anyone tell me the twofold purpose of building the Tower of Babel? Make a name for themselves. And number 2 was to prevent themselves from being scattered. And when we look at that, we see the very first idea or concept of what we know as globalization, of bringing and uniting all people into one. And when we look at Babel, there's just one more thing I want to throw out, because we keep in mind things that we learn about Babel, we're going to want to try to keep in mind and compare and contrast to the end time Babylon. But how many different languages were there at the time of Babel? There was one. And then God scattered them. We will be picking up today on page 10. And point number 3, the religion of Babel. When we look at the religious aspect of Babel, we said before about Babel, the city representing political Babylon, as we see in Revelation chapter, I believe it's 18, and the tower itself representing religious Babylon, or religious Babel, as we see also mimicked in Revelation chapter 17. But when we come down to all the religious centers of the world, temples, synagogues, so forth and so forth, they all have their own form of someone being the head of the religion. And the Tower of Babel more likely had a system set up of priests and priestesses, and more than likely they were devoted to prostitution in the name of religion. As we've already talked about, archaeological evidence suggests that the building was given over to astrology, or the worship of the heavens. Once again, this is not only evidenced by drawings or anything like that they believe were of the constellations in the temple itself, but the fact that each of the levels were dedicated to one of the planets. And when we look at the whole purpose of the tower itself, it was to reach the heavens. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11, we're going to be focusing on chapter 11 and jumping back to chapter 10 today. Does someone want to go ahead and read Genesis chapter 11 and verse 4 for me, please?
And they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth."
Let us build a tower that the top may reach unto heaven. Just double checking. Brother Terry, Brother Josh, and Sister Tiffany, do you guys have the notes of Babel? You don't? Okay, can anyone tell me anything specific about your King James Version of the Bible? Anything that jumps out in that passage that might correspond with the translation of the Bible itself?
May reach.
May reach. What's so special about may reach?
It's italicized.
It's italicized. Does anybody know why those words would be italicized in the King James Bible? They it would be italicized to give us a better understanding. There isn't a Hebrew word or Greek word for every word in our English language. So when they were translating it, there were a few words that the translators threw in to help us have a better understanding of the passage. So what they would do to make sure that the reader would know that they were their words thrown in there, they italicized them to separate them from every other portion of the Bible. Now keep in mind there was a rigorous method in the translation of the King James Bible, which means multiple people would have had to agree that this was the correct translation. Now, how many times have we thought that the whole purpose of the tower was to go all the way into heaven itself? To reach the throne room of God. Now, we need to backtrack a little bit. What did Josephus say concerning the tower? Do you remember? How did Nimrod want to construct it? What was the purpose of its height? It wasn't to, and I realize we're going back to history. He said that it wasn't to go all the way into heaven, but Nimrod only wanted to build a tower into the heavens or the skies, high enough that if God sent a flood again, that they would be high enough above it. The other thing too is when we get into into the study of this passage, we got to keep in mind that there's how many different heavens are there? 3. 3. How do we know that there's 3? The Apostle Paul wrote concerning a man who was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Now, if you're like me and you want to break everything apart and start diving into things, you start looking at words, you start looking at translations, and not being a scholar, you look to see other passages where that Hebrew word was used. Everywhere that the word for heaven is used, that Hebrew word, there's no separation between heaven where God resides, heaven where the stars are, or heaven where the birds fly. But it would be, I would think, comical to think that it would be that they were trying to reach the throne room of God itself, but rather they were trying to make it ascend into the sky. In fact, it's interesting, according to Wilmington's Guide to the Bible, he claims that this phrase should read, whose top is heaven. And when we look at it from a religious standpoint, a religious worship standpoint, that wouldn't be uncommon because that's where the priest or the priestess would reside over whatever religious rituals of the day were going on. And we see that in how many other pagan societies as well being mimicked and mocked. We talked about that ziggurat being copied. How do you get copies of similar structures of pyramids on different continents? The Aztecs, the Egyptians, they all came from somewhere. When you go through any other pagan religion, what do they do on the top of these pyramids? That's where they offer the sacrifices. Where did it come from? More than likely Babel. And once again, we go back to the words of Josephus that the top of the tower was to be high enough just to escape any floods that God may send to the earth. Now keep in mind when we start studying about the structure of how the bricks were prepared, how they were covered with slime, that also reinforces the idea that more than likely they were trying to escape a flood than anything, because the slime and the burnt brick would have made it sturdier than any other, and the slime would have waterproofed it. Now, if we look at the religion itself, if astrology was truly the first cult of the day, we find the devil's first real attack, besides mankind, on God's creation itself. And it's not just any attack, but it's a violation of the very first 2 commandments. If someone would please read Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 5. Exodus 20, 3 through 5.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of our fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me.
Hold that passage for me, Mom, because we're going to come back and reference it. Now, if we're studying the Bible, what's one of the key things to remember here about the Ten Commandments? Are they given yet? No. But the very first two commandments that God gave was, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not make any other gods in any graven image. And what is that three-clause passage in the... I don't remember what verse, Mom, I'm sorry. It'd be the second commandment.
In the earth, in the water.
Yep. And what's the very first one?
In heaven above.
In heaven above. What's in heaven above? Stars, constellations. We can go with birds, you can go with all that other stuff as well, because we know that they worship animal-like creatures as well. But in the heavens above, when we look at this, it was an attack on what some believe to be God's first recording of the gospel story. There are those that believe that before the Bible, God first recorded the gospel message in the constellations. It's a great theory. I don't see any Bible to back it up as far as proving it in that way. But it is an attack on God's creation. When it was an attack of the devil on God's creation, first of all, because God cares about the stars. He cares about his creation. What does Psalms chapter 147 and verse 4 states? That they have names. So the stars have names. And what the other thing we keep in mind here is the devil was corrupting man's concept of God's creation. And he was restructuring it for his own benefit. We also talked about if this was the first cult or so forth, we still see it in existence today. How many people go to read their horoscope? And what's the horoscope based off of? The constellations. And when you start studying out constellations and the zodiacs, you find that it's been a very, very long time since I've done any studying, but they are all separated into so many houses. Now, when we come to the heavens itself, the stars are in which heaven? The second heaven. And this appears to be the residing place of some of the spiritual wickedness. If someone would please read Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. Ephesians 6:12.
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Against spiritual wickedness in high places. I know I don't have my trail down showing where I got all my information or where I came to the conclusion, but when you study out this verse, it's an indication that there are some of the spiritual wickedness, some of the ruling principalities of the air, the thrones and dominions. There are some of them with their thrones in among the constellations in outer space.
Brother Justin,
Yes.
you were saying about them putting italicized words in the Bible. If you would read it without that italicized word, it says against spiritual wickedness in high.
That's interesting, Sister Did you know what? When I was studying, I didn't catch that. I did not catch that one. But that is interesting. Definitely have to take a second look at that one. Not that it changes any meaning, because, but that is definitely very interesting. And for me it was because we all assumed that the devil was the power of the air. Or was anybody else like me that they assumed that his throne was just in the constellations above us? When you start studying out that verse, where the devil is the prince of the power of the air, found in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, it doesn't imply outer space. But everywhere where that Greek word is used, for air, it is comparable to that of breathable air, that you take in. We find comparisons. If someone would please read Acts chapter 22, verse 23. Acts 22 and 23. And 1 Thessalonians 4:17. 1 Thessalonians 4:17.
Notice they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air.
They threw dust where?
Into the air.
Air into outer space? No. Breathable air. Air down here on our level is breathable. What about 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17?
And we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord.
Okay, I realize that could be one of the worst comparisons I could have pulled out, possibly for a clear meaning, but it's still referring to breathable air. I mean, to just back up, all these verses have the exact same word used in it. What about 1 Corinthians 9:6?
For I only and Barnabas have not the power to bear working.
Is that 1 Corinthians 9:6?
Yes. Is it 2 Corinthians?
It could be. You know me and my typos. I get to writing down.
This I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly.
Okay. Then maybe I just completely butchered that one. I must have wrote something down wrong. But regardless, we're talking about breathable air. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I want us to step back. And when I've been trying to prepare this, I've been doing my best to show you how the foundations of Babel will take us into the end times. While it may not be exactly the same, there are similarities. What are some of the similarities that we see between Babel and the end time Babylon?
Trying to make us all one world.
One world government, globalization. We talked about that last week. How do we see that at Babel? And I realize I'm being silly to a degree, but so we're all on the same page. What was going on at Babel that they were one world?
Because Nimrod went in to build that tower so that they could be all together in case anything happened.
And we see that mankind was coming together with one mindset, one purpose. And this purpose was to rebel against the God of heaven. How does that compare to the end time? To the last Babylon? What are some things that we might see in Scripture or what's going to happen? They were coming together to rebel against God of heaven. In the end times, when it comes to the tribulation period and Babylon at that time, are they going to come together for a specific purpose? Do they know who they're coming against? They're coming against God. And they know that they're against God. I think it's Revelation chapter 9, that the prominent men are hiding in the rocks and caves, crying out, who will save us from the wrath of the Lamb? They know who they're going against. We look at, is it 19? Actually, it might be chapter 20 of Revelation. The armies of the world are all gathered on top of Mount Megiddo. They have gathered together for one purpose, and that is not only just to rebel against God of heaven, but to lead a war and to try to defeat him. So we have the aspect of globalization in Babel, the coming together for one purpose. We find it in the final Babel. What else do we see similarities between? Well, let's start here. How many languages were at Babel? Why is that so important that there's one religion? And I'm not looking for that because God didn't scatter them abroad yet. But how does one religion, how does one language benefit them? They can communicate with very little hindrance. Or in that day, there was no hindrance. Everyone understood everyone. It made communication, it made progress so much more faster because there was nothing, no translation, nothing to do this, nothing to do that. Communication wasn't broken down. More than likely, it wasn't like us even with brain. We might both speak English even though it's a different form. You know, a boot to us is something you put on your foot. To them, a boot is something that's the trunk of their car. You know, there weren't anything even different like that, but there was a lot easier communication. Do we see anything like that leading into the end times? You know, you might not see it in Scripture, but is there anything today that may make language easier? You have a French person, you have an English person.
Well, most other countries learn English.
We have a lot of other countries learning English 1. But even for somebody who does not know English, what about the computer? It translates it like that. You know, I don't know, they still consider us living in the age of information. But if we look at the progression of technology, who remembers dial-up?
Yeah.
Do you want to go back to the days of dial-up?
No.
When was the last time you had a dial-up experience on a computer? I mean, just comparing that within what? 14 years? 30 years? There was a great advancement in technology in the 1990s, from planes to automobiles to computers. Technology is rapidly increasing, and it's making communication a whole lot easier. I seen that cartoon the other week of all these people standing in heaven, just looking at their hands like this. And an angel's taking St. Peter around heaven, and he's asking Peter, what's going on with this new batch? Everybody else is so happy with this new batch, are just so sad, and they keep looking at their hands. And he said, well, they no longer have their phones in their hand. They don't know how to communicate. You know, everybody nowadays is communicating with somebody. Their cell phone is constantly in their hand. Why? Because communication is so much easier. You can send a message around the world even quicker than you can now, and computer can translate it. So even in our day and age, we are seeing, I wouldn't say one language, but we are seeing the barriers being broken down at a fast rate. That if Brother Eli would be African and I would be English, or vice versa, I could send him something on the computer and within seconds he could translate it into his language. What else do we see going on?